The first is growth. And that's not too surprising. Whenever we have asked this, and we've done this survey for about 10 years now, growth is always the number one thing that CEOs are focused on. But what's interesting, though, is what they're looking to drive that growth as you go into 2025 into 2026. Because the second priority that they have is really about technology. And that's number two, and it was also about 25% higher than our previous sample. So they're looking at technology, and make no mistake about what they're thinking about when they're thinking about technology, and that's AI. So we have a separate question just about what the CEOs think is going to most change or have the best impact on their industry over the next 3 years. And the number one thing that they talk about is AI. About 3/4 point to that. So technology is second, really driven about AI. The third we call corporate, but the best way to understand that is really about the organization's operating model. It's plumbing, how it works. CEOs are really looking, particularly again, to AI to help lighten the organization, make it more nimble, more resilient, more innovative. So they have a whole lot of interest in just how can they make the organization itself perform better. The next one, and this is always because it's of great interest to our CHROs, is workplace or the workers. And that had climbed right towards the top of the list over the last few years for some obvious reasons around pandemic and so on. But we had noticed some softening last year. So when we last looked at this, it was in the third place, but it had come down in absolute terms. It's now slid to fifth place. And we can dig into a little bit more about what's going on there. Could just be a settling of the post-pandemic environment, but I do think there's some risks there that are evident in that slide from third to fifth. And then the last thing, just because it hadn't been on that top 10 for the last few years, but now has come back to the top 10, is risk. There's clearly some greater interest among CEOs in just the environment that they're operating in, a sense of the riskiness of that environment, and a real desire for transparency of the risks that they're facing. I'll answer that really on kind of two levels. The first is just why are we bringing this information to CHROs? And the biggest reason is that the assumptions, the concerns, the priorities of CEOs ultimately then come downhill, right? And so it's incredibly important that CHROs align their priorities with the priorities of those CEOs. So that's the main reason that we're bringing this, is to help equip them to have the kinds of conversations that they need with their CEOs to really understand what's in the background, what are those assumptions that are influencing the priorities of the CEOs. So that's at the biggest level. But if you get down into the details, there are implications for CHROs across all of these things. Now, one of the ways that we organize the data and we talk about it is, and it goes back to what I was saying really about the operations and the how CEOs are looking to drive that growth. They're looking for a more dynamic organization. We use the term dynamic capacity to talk about that, which I know is a little bit of a, what do you mean by that? But it really is just how are our people and technology, those intelligent machines that are going to be increasingly pervasive in organizations, how's that going to work together to drive better products, better experience, better operations, higher profitability and growth, and all those sorts of things. So when we think about that, it's not hard to find the CHRO in there. That can be everything from, there's a lot of evidence that CEOs are looking for growth through expansion. That can be organic expansion. A lot of evidence they're looking at M&A opportunities. So if they undertake an acquisition somewhere, that's a lot of work for an HR organization. It's all the, thinking through all the capabilities, all the staffing, potential displacements, who's going to run what, all those sorts of things. So that's one. If you think about that organizational one, the corporate, a lot about that is who's making what decisions. So at a big level, and this is a little futuristic, but we see smart machines, smart technologies permeating workplaces. That can be your photocopier ordering ink when it needs it on its own, but you could imagine more advanced applications of this. So that all of a sudden brings in some really interesting questions about org design, the role of leaders and managers, how many you need in their spans of control. So we see evidence of that. And you can really go through each one of these and find the CHRO, a lot about how it's going to affect our people, how it's going to affect our leaders and what they need, the role that the CHRO and the HR function can play in enabling a culture that can accommodate all of this technology, but then also really using that culture to drive innovation and creativity and value added. So really, it's not hard to find the CHRO really across all of it. The number one action is use this to test your assumptions about what is in the mind of your CEO. Now, CHROs, I hope, have a great, open, transparent, candid relationship with their CEOs, but that's not always the case, right? And so, again, it's incredibly important to understand what's in the background. So I'll use it for the example. What are their assumptions about acquisitions and growth? Are they looking to do more M&A activity, or are they looking to expand more organically? It would be good to know just what's their mindset and expectation. That would tell you, well, do we really need to buff up that integration playbook or not, for example. Another area is just what are their assumptions about managers? How many we need, what their scope is, what their loads are. There's evidence in the data that we talk about that CEOs would like to expand the span of control of managers and take layers out of the organization. That has huge implications for CHROs and for HR to determine, okay, what's that going to mean for how many managers we need? How do we equip them effectively? How do we help them? Because we see a lot of evidence that managers feel very overwhelmed already, much less if you were to expand, how many direct reports they have, for example. So it all starts really with a message of, we're providing you with the kinds of things that CEOs are thinking about. Have you had this conversation? Do you know not only what's in the mind of your CEO, but to what extent they believe this is going to be something that they want to act on today, tomorrow, 2025, or a little bit further down the road? Because some of the things, especially when I was talking about AI, there's a lot of hope and expectation for how AI will change organizations, how they operate, how they can create value, all these kinds of things. And my guess is that over some time horizon, a lot of those expectations will be realized, but it is still very much a learning journey at this stage. Where we talk about it at Gartner as it's in the trough of disillusionment. This is where the hard work comes into play, and the expectations generally outstrip the reality. So anyway, the point being that CHROs are going to have to push back a little bit on some of those expectations in some cases. Try to calibrate how the CEO is thinking about the pace of change they might want to drive. And those could be difficult conversations. So really it is about equipping them to make sure that they have had the conversations, have what they need, they're on the same page so that they can begin to set their priorities effectively. Some of them are just related to perceptions and expectations. And I'll focus on a big one, just given the role of technology and particularly AI across all of the findings. It is clearly influencing all the different dimensions of the way that the CEO is thinking about their organization and growth and value creation and so on. Now, the HR function, generally speaking, within organizations is not always seen as the primary player in a lot of those decisions about where technology gets deployed. It's probably not unusual to think, well, when you think about who's setting AI strategy, who's rolling it out, the CIO is a leader at that table. When you start thinking about that corporate category that I was talking about, that is sort of number 3 on how do you think about the organization, oftentimes that's the CFO talking about that. But what our research at Gartner has shown is that there is a high risk of misdeploying those technology investments if the implications on the workforce isn't made a primary input into those decisions. And who has that expertise? The CHRO and the HR function has that expertise. We're seeing more and more evidence. We call it human first AI, that if you do not take a human first AI approach to those investments, you are just as likely, maybe even more likely, to do harm than to actually improve performance and productivity. And that can be through things like just creating disruptions and rework and these sorts of things within organizations. So it's incredibly important that the CHRO engage in building that strong connection with the CIO, with the CFO, their other C-suite peers, to really ensure that the implications on these decisions on the workforce are taken fully into account, and they can move forward together. The top 10, if you will, does stay fairly stable. There are some changes, like I mentioned, risk, for example, has not been on that top 10 list for the last couple of years. I think the last time it was in that list was 2021, and so now it's back. And I think you can ask why is it back? What's motivating that now concern about risk? It's not hard to imagine elections, not just in the United States, but around the world. About 50% of the world's population was in a country that was undergoing an election in 2024. So that creates possible shifts in policy and a lot of risk in that operating environment. That's one. We have geopolitics, the wars across the Middle East and those sorts of things. That raises a lot of risk concerns, as well as now we've got AI, right? And that we know that's going to be changing how things are going to operate. So risk is a new one, wasn't on the list, now on the list. I talked about the workforce that had been third, and then we noticed was holding its rank order, but had softened. Now it has slipped back to fifth. And as we've thought about that, and I don't have a sharp explanation that would exactly explain it, could be a couple of different things. One could just be, again, workforce issues that were so acute during the pandemic have now stabilized. Maybe it's just settled a little bit, and CEOs are thinking just more about technology and the organization and how do they now grow moving forward. And so it's not that they're unconcerned about the workforce, they're just less concerned relative to other things. That could be part of it. But it could also be, I think, and this is where I worry about a blind spot that they might have, is that there could be a sense of, well, AI is going to drive our future. Our people are not as important anymore relative to that. And as I talked about, like that would be a real risk if they are thinking in those terms, because again, the way that you unlock the value of that technology is in that human first approach. You've got to ask yourself first, where does this enable our people to do the work we need them to do better, perform that better? So if that's slipping, knowing why becomes an incredibly important conversation for the CHRO to have with the CEO, to really understand what is motivating that. Do they really feel less concerned about, do they have the skills that they need? Do they have the people that they need? Are those people engaged in the organization? We've seen walkbacks from some of the pandemic era policies. We talked about risk. That's a big risk, right? Are they willing to let some people walk out the door because they no longer have the flexibility that they once had, or not? And that's a conversation that the leadership team, the CHRO, the CEO, and so on really, really needs to have. So those are a couple things. And then the last one I'd put to is, I mentioned the corporate. While that's usually high, it grew by 63% since our previous sample. So that just isn't, the magnitude of it is just indicative of the real drive to, can we be a better organization? Can we be a different organization going forward by how we think about our org design, how we think about our operating model, the role of technology and people within that? We can think differently about just how we get the work done that we need to do.